So in the previous videos, we've been discussing video game moments, those moments that happen in-game that aren't planned or prepared by the game makers. They're just enjoyable moments that you can play and kind of never see again. However, creators like Sony and Microsoft tend to have more of a cinematic feel to their games. This doesn't mean that they're not learning, they just don't know what to do. This creates an interesting problem where a game like, say, Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, which has a lot of cinematics, is promoted for its cinematic appeal instead of the giant open-world gameplay that people enjoy. I think Microsoft is starting to figure out that there is a difference, what with Halo Infinite and all. However, there is another factor that you have to get into. Sony and Microsoft do not want a game that continues to sell for a long period of time, in the same way that San Andreas has been selling even today, in the same way that New Super Mario Bros. Is still selling, in the same way that New Super Mario Bros. 2 is still selling. The 3DS is gone, they're still selling those games, because the games continue to sell. So Sony and Microsoft are just going, well, why do we do this? Why do we sell these games that will have this long, long lifespan? Well, first off, because they don't want to. They kind of want you to play a game for as long as it exists, a 2-month period. They consider this a movie kind of thing. It releases, it has 2 good months, and then it's gone. And they're good with that. So long as it was popular in those 2 months, it'll get a sequel. Anything after that is gravy to them. However, it does appear that Microsoft is learning something. You see, these games, these long-tail games, are also the games that are synonymous with the sales of that console. Let's get into this a little bit. If you talk about Xbox, you immediately think of Halo. You think of Gears of War. These are games that have sold and sold well on the Xbox. So what do you expect to find on Xbox? Games similar to Halo and Gears of War. It just makes sense. Then we have Sony, the PlayStation 2. What game has sold well and you just kind of find synonymous with it? The answer is Grand Theft Auto. It's the top of the list. You immediately think of it without really trying. There's other games, and you enjoy them. There's nothing wrong with those games. But the games that just seem to be one with that console is Grand Theft Auto. It's the reason why Grand Theft Auto 5 is still being remade today, because it has such a long shelf life. They want to continue to sell consoles, but they don't want it to compete against the old sales. So they just update the graphics a little and say, oh, well, it's now for the new console now. Check it out. You should buy the new console. But they don't like this because if it's a long game, then what are they going to do with it? I mean, it's competing against other games being made, and they want continuous sales. They don't want this game sold really well, sold a ton of consoles, and then all the games in between just didn't do as well because people were busy playing the other game. Well, that does make a lot of sense until you realize that when they become synonymous, they also become system sellers. The more games you have that are just mind-blowing, the type of games that you just associate with that console, the more you're going to sell. If you like, Zelda, you're going to like some other open-world fantasy games. If you like Mario, then you're going to enjoy platformers. If you enjoy Pikmin, then, you know what, I don't know of another game like Pikmin, honestly. But you get the idea. If you like Xbox, you like Halo. That's how it works. This is the game that sold you the console, and you're looking for other games like it. So Microsoft has figured out that open worlds, well, at least we hope, the game isn't actually released yet. Halo Infinite, this is the only video I've got. And I hope that it's a giant open world FPS shooter game. That would be awesome. I would buy a console just for this game. But we don't know yet. We don't know anything. We are willing to look down and, look away on the graphics, on the glitches, on everything if it lives up to the hype given to it just by these kinds of videos. Will it? We don't know yet. But the potential is there. That's why they really sold this game, because they know this will sell the Xbox. And if it sells the Xbox, then other console games will sell along with it. Yeah, they're not going to sell as well as Halo Infinite or Mario, but they're going to sell better because there's more people buying the console. So that's how it all works. Okay, so we know what Sony and Microsoft are up to, but what about Nintendo? Well, the truth is, all the other companies consider video games to be part of their console business. Sony wants to continue selling music and kind of disrupt the PC scene. Microsoft is trying to stop Sony. And because of that, they're making these major sales. They're trying to compete against each other so that they can protect all their other sales. That's why they're doing it. They don't consider a game to be just their major thing, and that's how they sell. However, Nintendo sells video games first, and everything else comes second. Those movies, they're to promote games. Those great McDonald's sales, well, that was a promotion for a game. It continues to sell the games, and that makes them a lot of money. They make great games, and it gets them licensing to make more games. Games are important to them. How did this come to be? Well, it's actually a fascinating story because Nintendo didn't start off as a video game company. In fact, when they started, video games and even computers didn't exist. They were around during the major era when Japan was just entering into the open field. They were opening up and they had traders and dealers going everywhere. They made card games for the Yakuza because that's who bought them. Nintendo has never been one to care who buys something so long as it's bought. Well, several years later, literally decades later, they start to really open up. Bunch of things happen, an entire war, honestly, and they just kind of go, okay, well, we've got some investment money from the U.S. What do we do with this? They tried love hotels, which are places where somebody who is married goes to kind of, how do I put this? Have sex. There's thin walls in Japan. You kind of want to go somewhere to have sex with your wife. They had hotels specifically for that. They also had hotels where you could have sex with someone who wasn't your wife. This was a more entertaining place. And you know what? Nintendo had both. They also had vacuum cleaners, TVs, all this other stuff. But then they found that they were selling really well on toys because one of the people designing everything or making everything in the factories turned out to be just this absolutely amazing toy maker. He could make a really good toy with very little. And this made them a lot of money. The president of Nintendo heard about him, checked it out, hired the guy and said, okay, you're in charge of the toy company. Do what you have to do. The guy's name was Gunpei Yokoi, and he was a master. So when video games came along, he was in charge, because video games, to the Japanese, to Nintendo, were sort of a toy thing. They did so well that they became a video game company that happened to sell card games and made toys. You can still buy some of their toys, by the way. And their card games are really expensive nowadays, especially the Peanuts cards and all that. But that's how they started. They made really good games using very basic systems. Nintendo has always been the former Yakuza who became a toy maker. He's so good at toys, he just gave up the other business. In fact, when Shigeru Miyamoto applied to be at Nintendo, he didn't bring a game reel. He didn't bring, ideas for video games. He didn't even really know about video games. Instead, he brought coat hangers for kids with little designs on them so that kids would really enjoy them. Nintendo has always had this skill of taking what they have, which could be very basic, and making it look good. They really worked on style over substance, or actually maybe substance over style. Honestly, I don't know how to say that correctly. They worked really hard to make sure everything felt good. So you play Mario Sunshine, and you know what? They'll skip around certain things, but the game will stand up even to this day. You check out a game like The Wind Waker, and even today it looks good, whereas other games haven't sold as well. They have aged terribly because Nintendo specifically tried to make their games look good over just looking great or looking good for its era. They weren't trying for the best graphics. They were trying for what would actually work with the console they have. That doesn't make a lot of sense until you play one of their games. It's just graphically amazing. And it's often kind of weird when they try to update their graphics because sometimes they don't quite work out. They don't quite look right. And it's one of those weird things about Nintendo. So, that brings up a question. Why did Nintendo screw up? You see, they did screw up. The Legend of Zelda series, one of their absolute best series, was selling badly. It was losing sales. It wasn't doing as well. Less people were buying it. The games looked great. And for what they were a ton of fun to play. But they weren't as good. And let's just get into this a bit. Originally, when Nintendo released a Zelda game, it was so good it actually showed up in my dreams. I had actual dreams about Link to the Past or Link's Quest, Link's Adventure, depending on where you are. Zelda 2. They were absolutely amazing open world games. They introduced whole styles of games to other people. They perfected them if they weren't the inventors. So people really noticed when they made a really good Zelda game. Something called Zelda would be the equivalent of, oh, this is a good game. So there are a lot of games that are like, oh, this is Zelda-esque, oh, you have to do this. But they started to fall into a formula, and you really start to notice it in Ocarina of Time. If you want to move ahead, what you do is you pick up the items to help you move to the next level. And I'll tell you a little trick. You don't actually have to beat the boss. You just need to pick up the item. So a lot of the time, you pick up the item, you move on to the next quest. And you just keep doing that until you've built yourself up so high that the bosses are really easy. It's an old trick, but I love doing that. That's how I play, honestly. But this was probably the moment when they were at their top, their absolute height. Something happened where they kind of lost the formula. During the Wii era, they sold a game called Skyward Sword for Zelda. And it was perhaps the absolute best game. I mean, graphically, it was competing with other consoles, with much better graphical abilities. It was so beautiful, you didn't care. It was so kind of mesmerizing. It just made you feel kind of with it. And yet, the game itself wasn't that good. It was so full of cinematics. It was so full of puzzles that it didn't live up to the amazingness that the graphics and style it had. So why? What was going on? Well, The truth is, the creator of Zelda handed his reins over to someone else, and that someone else thought that Zelda was all about puzzles and this story. So he made this absolutely amazing game with a lot of puzzles and story, but not a lot of Zelda feel to it. To give you an idea of how poorly it went, here's The Legend of Zelda for Nintendo. Zelda 2 selling at 5.04 million, Legend of Zelda 7.37. Link to the Past around the same as the original Zelda, so it kept the fans together. Link's Awakening 10.62, not bad. Game Boy was selling better as well. Ocarina of Time 13.82. Just look at that number. But then you realize that for the N64 it sold 7.6, which means that it continued to sell. This is actually something you realize when you start looking at sales numbers. If a game sells well or does well, it will attract the same amount of fans it had beforehand. But you'll notice a drop. See that Wind Waker? 6.7. A little lower, but that's okay. Then you check out Twilight Princess, 10 million. Phantom Hourglass, 7.7. Then Skyward Sword. That's 4 million when I round up. It's not doing well. But then you ask, well, can it do better? And the answer is, of course it can. In fact, it can do greater, so long as they do it right. We can see the same with Mario Brothers, or Mario. There's just so many different names for it, they don't know how to name it. But Super Mario Brothers originally sold about 40 million for the NES. Then about 7.4 for Super Mario 2. Super Mario 3, respectable 24 million. Not bad. 17 million for the NES. That's a bit of a drop, but understandable. We'll say that 17 million is the height of its sales. So Super Mario Land actually sold a little bit more. Super Mario World, if you look, 20.610 million. That makes sense. Did a little bit better because it was being sold for the Super Nintendo. It was kind of selling the Super Nintendo, in fact. And then we kind of have to go all the way over to Super Mario 64, and you'll notice it doesn't sell as well. However, when it was released for the DS, it sold about the same amount as it did for the N64, about 11 million. Then we go to Super Mario Sunshine, 6.3 million. Then we go to New Super Mario Bros. 2. Well, that's a bit different. 30 million. Nearly 31 million. Then for New Super Mario Bros. Wii, that sold 30 million. So it continues to sell well and continues to have a high sales number because people respect those games. However, Super Mario Bros. 2 didn't sell as well. Mario Galaxy didn't sell as well. Super Mario 3D Land didn't sell as well, though you'll notice the numbers are about the same, about 12.8 million. New Super Mario Bros. U? Honestly, it dropped, but we're not going to count it too much. New Super Mario 3D World, once again, drop. Super Mario Maker, drop. And it keeps going down. Oh, Super Mario Odyssey, though, 20 million, almost to that 30 million mark. Basically, what you see is if it does well and it hits the right fans, the fans will happily buy it in the 30 million range for Mario Brothers. And that is what we would consider the community of fans for Mario to be. In the same way, the top-selling game is about 13 million for Zelda. So if you were looking for this is what the community should look like, it should be about 13 million. So it should come as no surprise that Grand Theft Auto San Andreas sold 21.5 million, or a large proportion of the fans of the PS2. If you start asking questions about, didn't it sell 160 million? The answer is yes, but not to 160 million people. It probably sold it to 30 to 40 million people. But we generally let Sony lie. It lies about sales numbers a lot, console-wise. So, just kind of let it be. You don't want to dig too deep into that subject, by the way. By the way, that number, 110 million for Grand Theft Auto 5, well, that's a bit harder to figure out because they're not giving exact answers for when they sold for each console. You have to check a lot more for that. But it's selling well enough that they're remaking it and then remaking it again. So that should give you an idea. Nintendo recognized there was something wrong. In fact, Shigeru Miyamoto, the guy who started off with coat hangers, also became one of the greatest video game makers of all time. I don't think anybody will ever disagree with that. And this gets into an interesting subject, because he saw the sales numbers. He knew Zelda wasn't doing too well, and he helped make that game. So he went to the creator, or the guy in charge of it now, and he said, okay, listen, you need to fix this. Otherwise, I'm going to take you off the team. You will no longer direct these games. And, that was a big thing. I mean, publicly saying out loud that he had to tell this guy, Eiji Aonuma, that he had to fix it or there would be problems. That's a very un-Japanese thing unless you're in a lot of trouble. So it comes as no surprise that he was watching Skyward Sword very carefully. He said, yes, this looks like Zelda, but it needs more work. And he became a lot more strict. And the director of The Legend of Zelda actually changed. Eiji Aonuma became the producer, but not the director. So what's going on? Well, this new director and the old producer started looking at Zelda, started looking at Zelda 2 and Zelda 1 and the Zeldas that sold really well. And they started to ask questions. What makes these games so good? And they found that it wasn't the story, it wasn't the puzzles. It wasn't even the dungeons as they thought of them. It was, in fact, the way the game played, the open world, the ability to choose what you were going to do next. So they started looking at games like that, in the same way that The Legend of Zelda was based on a lot of other games like Ultima and open world games. The new Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was going to be based on, Grand Theft Auto, other games, only set in a Zelda world. You get to choose the horse you play. You get to hike wherever you want to. You get to do whatever you want to, at the way you want to. Yes, they might control the way your eye moves, but you're playing this game how you want to. If you want to, you could just run headlong into the battle. You could challenge these characters as much as you wanted. You could go straight to the boss while wearing only underwear, if you wanted to. However, most people didn't. They enjoyed playing the game itself. They enjoyed cooking. They enjoyed finding new things to do. And because of that, they just... Oh, that was foolish. Anyway, they continue to sell. And you'll notice the way they promoted the game was going to be that this will be the game to sell the Switch. And they really promoted this idea. They really showed it off, how this game was going to do for them. Instead of trying to make another Zelda game, they decided to make the ultimate Zelda game, the absolute pinnacle of Zelda games. They had to bring in a lot of extra people. They had a lot of outside work. People who knew open worlds better were brought in. People who knew how to connect worlds together. People who knew the Unreal Engine. This was a completely new thing for Nintendo. They were accustomed to making their own levels, making their own game engine, doing everything themselves. This was the first time, basically, where they went, okay, we're going to make this, using everything everyone else has so that we can make a best game possible. And they removed as much as they could when it came to story or how the story worked. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of story in this game, but most of it is you trying to figure out what the story is. Finding out, looking at that ancient world and going, how does that work? They only had 4 dungeons, and to be honest, there's a lot of puzzles in these dungeons. They couldn't quite remove it from Eiji Aonuma's idea of what Zelda should be. But they did what they could, and they let you attack the dungeons in whatever order you felt like. They let you do whatever you felt like when it came to this game. And this created a whole new world, and it sold well. It actually went above and beyond what any other game sale for the Zelda series sold, selling 23.14 million. In case you're trying to figure out what that number would equivalent to, let's look at San Andreas and those other games again. The top-selling game for Grand Theft Auto is about 25 million, or the equivalent of what it or what Zelda sold. So literally, The Legend of Zelda sold to approximately the same amount of people, and many times the same people, who bought Grand Theft Auto. They realized who their actual sales customers were and started to sell to them. It didn't involve stealing horses, though you could do that in the game. It involved the open world, the exploration, the people you could see, the way things continued to move around, how people could go to bed or have a schedule they kept throughout the day. This is what sold The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, and which continues to sell the game even to this day. You continue to see it for sale at Walmart, which means it very likely will continue to sell even after the Switch is dead and gone. That is the equivalent of San Andreas. In fact, Nintendo realized they could do that same thing with Mario. And we don't know the end results just yet, because Bowser's Fury just came out as the making of this video. Literally, I think, a few days ago. So I can't be like, oh, well, it's selling gangbusters. I don't know yet. But it is number 1 in Japan and number 1 in many countries right now. So it's selling really, really well. Nintendo realized they could make a 3D platformer using the knowledge they made for Zelda. They actually realized what a giant 3D game should be played like. And because of that, they made a good game. They've always been good game makers. But this is the first time where they look back and go, okay, yeah, we've made some mistakes, gameplay-wise, and we need to fix this. Every time they do that, we end up with a good game. New Super Mario Bros. Wii was made because they realized that people continued to sell or buy New Super Mario Bros. They realized there was a niche. But have they made a new Super Mario Bros.? Not recently, honestly. They've got some problems, and Nintendo is still trying to figure things out, and I'll be honest, I think there's a bit of ego involved. But they are learning, whereas the other companies don't seem to be learning as fast. It really is unknown if Sony will figure it out, or if Halo Infinite really is the game that I think it is. But we do know Nintendo has learned, and I think that's the best we can do for now. So I think that finishes off my study on why Grand Theft Auto San Andreas continues to sell. It's just a giant open world game with the ability to just see and do things that other games don't offer. So you continue to find it. Have video game companies figured it out? No. For the most part, no. And even the one that has figured it out still has problems. Is still kind of having to correct itself. So we'll have to see from this point on. Thank you to all the video game guys I stole their videos from. I'll make sure to leave links to their stuff in the description of this video. Check them out. There's a lot of really cool work there. What else? Hit like and subscribe. Follow me. See what my next videos are going to be about. I don't know either. I don't really have an idea. I have some hints about single stories I'm going to work on, but I have hit the studies end, so I got to find a new study to do. So I'll catch you all later, and leave a comment on games you think kind of fit into this description. Bye for now.